Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is the United States in a better place or worse on the global stage than it was 4 years ago? And what should Joe Biden consider if he takes U.S. foreign policy in a different direction? Let's get to the bottom line. Outgoing President Donald Trump loved to be the anti-diplomat, insulting countries and their leaders, and even his own ambassadors and bureaucrats, and just making sure everyone felt on the edge all the time. He was a transactionalist, wanting to do deals, but often it was very hard to see if those deals made sense in the end for the country. What have the consequences been for the United States under a president who preferred dramatic decisions and one-off deals to long-term alliances? What parts of Trump's foreign policy should be thrown out? And what parts will a Joe Biden presidency probably keep? Today, we're going to talk with one of America's most experienced diplomats and trade negotiators and chroniclers of U.S. foreign policy. Robert Zoellick has advised 6 U.S. presidents, was Deputy Secretary of State for President Bush, and is a former president of the World Bank. He just published America in the World, a history of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy, a very deep dive into the people and factors that have shaped America's foreign policy since the founding of the country. Ambassador Zoellick, thank you so much for joining us today. As I read your book, it's a fascinating collection of consequential personalities in U.S. foreign policy and inflection points. Whether it was Vannevar Bush and looking at a moment on how technology needed to be woven into national security, or Cordell Hull taking and expanding foreign policy to look about America's trade position in the world. And I'm interested in what your insights are on people and moments that matter, and whether we're at one of those inflection points today as we move from Trump to Biden.
It's been a momentous 4 years. Trump likes breaking things. He was delighted to disrupt the international system that the U.S. had helped create 70 years ago and adapted. So it's natural that everyone around the world wonders kind of what's coming next. But I also think there's 3 bigger challenges, Steve. One is that you're seeing the importance of what I'll call the new security issues. These are topics like security and climate, along with the traditional ones. Then you've also got on the economic side that the phenomenon of globalization continues, but you're seeing fragmentation in the international system. And then the third one is a lot of discussion about great power rivalry at the same time that you have to figure out how will you deal with these transnational issues in a multilateral cooperative fashion. So I think one of the challenges for the Biden administration will be, how will it sort of balance these, integrate them, and particularly work at home and with allies? And I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, can you walk through these different terrains that Joe Biden is going to have to consider that would be traditional for any president coming into U.S. foreign policy? You were beginning to get into them, but I'm wondering if you could kind of give us a structured survey of the territory that the president is going to have to consider.
Well, in some ways, I think the start goes back to some advice my former boss, James Baker, gave to President Ronald Reagan in 1981, which is he said, Mr. President, you've got 3 priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. Well, in this case, the focus is on pandemic and economic recovery. So that's got to be the priority issue for a new administration. But then the question is, whether the Biden people can connect some of their domestic agenda internationally. So, for example, with the vaccines and the medical treatments we expect next year, not just to rejoin the WHO, but could they come up with an initiative like President Bush 43 did with HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis to help the developing world? So you kind of expand on the WHO's role. My old institution, the World Bank, is going to be critical in extending the WHO, which really doesn't have the capacity internationally to try to help the developing world. Similarly, if you do something on immigration with Dreamers, why not connect it to a North American policy with Mexico? And by the way, it's going to be connected to an area that Biden worked on in the past, which is Central America and its sort of development and its security. In climate, you don't just rejoin the Paris Accord, but you probably have to focus on the 10 biggest economies and emitters, which are about 80 to 90% of the problem. But you can also bring in the developing world with initiatives like soil carbon, which could absorb a lot of carbon, but help African agriculture or forestation or avoided deforestation or adaptation. So the challenge is, can they connect the dots across these topics of some of the new issues, while they also have to watch the traditional ones like nuclear proliferation and sort of regional dangers.
So what you're basically saying, and I want to underscore this point, is given the domestic agenda, which is going to be huge, enormously time-consuming, is you're suggesting that he connect those, whether it's on the pandemic or economic growth, to something bridging it internationally, that would be a way to get it, essentially to scale global opportunities, but link them to a very active domestic agenda.
Well, yes, Steve, and think of the benefits. So for many Americans and people all around the world, issues of pandemic or climate are local in effect. But in a sense, you're partly trying to explain to the public who has to support your policies how these are connected with the global sort of context. Secondly, if you think about the agenda that I just talked about, that's a reasonable set of topics to start to rebuild ties with Europeans and your partners in the Asia Pacific. And then based on that cooperation, which is obviously sort of frayed a lot over the past 4 years, you can build what have to be the two most important issues for the future, which are the future of free societies and how you deal with China. So it's a multilateral strategy as well as a domestic strategy, and it focuses on what's on people's minds.
Well, Bob, you were one of the people who really laid out during the last Bush administration what our contours with China needed to be. In fact, you gave a very important speech saying that China needed to aspire to more. It needed to become a responsible global stakeholder. I remember speaking to you at that time, and it was almost as if you were the only one in that administration focused on China. And I'd love to hear where you think we go. Do you think the Biden team will take your heed and pay more attention to this country, both the negatives and potential opportunities? How is that going to be shaped? And are they going to go back to your words, skipping over Donald Trump's, and say that ought to be our goal?
Well, remember the context. That was a speech I gave in 2005. And what I was trying to point out was that for 20 years, administrations of both parties have been seeking to integrate China into the international system. World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, treaties dealing with proliferation or ozone development. And my point in 2005 was that the integration was well along its way. The question was whether China could step up to the responsibilities of the international system. And to be frank with you, Steve, over the past 4 years, I don't think either China nor the United States has acted as a responsible stakeholder. So I think right now the relationship is quite dangerous. I think it's been in free fall. I think the immediate challenge is, frankly, to get some off ramps. There's across the political spectrum, there's a lot of frustration and concern about China. So it's not going to go back to the way that it was in the past. But I think the natural process is, first you have to focus on what's at home, and that's part of the science and technology and education and kind of democratic agenda. Then you work with your allies and partners in both East Asia, and I think Europe will be important in this. And then you frankly are going to have a sort of multidimensional strategy with China on issues such as naval maritime security. You're going to probably need to sort of adapt some of your capacities to have what strategists call anti-access aerial denial, and that requires retooling some of our capabilities. In the trade area, can you push China on intellectual property rights? Well, it's interesting. They've expanded intellectual property rights courts, and foreigners win about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. So you want to push to raise the penalties. Similarly, on forced technology transfer, that's prohibited by China's accession to the WTO, but my guess is you need to get rid of a lot of the joint venture requirements. Now, my point on this is that the Trump approach over the past 4 years was to focus on the bilateral trade deficit with China. They didn't change it one iota. They raised a bunch of tariffs. And frankly, the deal that they cut for purchases has only been about kind of halfway in terms of its targets. And so it hasn't worked. And so the challenge for the United States is, I think, both to do things at home, work with partners, press China on some of these issues, And then ultimately, I also believe we need to stand for American values. As a good example, in the case of Hong Kong, rather than sanctioning leaders, I would open the doors for some people to Hong Kong to come to the US, just as Britain has done. And that would show the difference between the two societies. So China will be the biggest challenge for the United States over coming decades. But my recommendation is you don't just approach it one-on-one. You got to do it with other partners.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you, as you wrote your book, which I have found so instructive, you talk about the 5 traditions for American foreign policy and focusing on North America, looking at alliances, transnational technology and trade arrangements, rooting foreign policy into where voters are, into politics, and this notion of America as the unique place in the world, the unique and different spot that can make a very different thing. I'd love at this moment, because when I think about those, and you talk about China and the United States being in free fall, a lot of the world looks at the United States as being in free fall. So as you look at those traditions, I'd love to get your, tilt your view forward and talk to us a little bit about those 5 traditions, but how they're relevant today.
Okay, well, let's start with North America. So obviously it was pretty important for the United States history of the 19th century. I'd argue in the 20th century, it was always a cornerstone as well. I mean, we almost went to war with the Cuban Missile Crisis and had a nuclear disaster. You had NAFTA, which was trying to reorient towards a changing Mexico. We almost went to war again with Mexico earlier in the century. But actually, I think the most telling guidance comes from Ronald Reagan's speech in 1979, launching his campaign. And it's almost unbelievable today a candidate would say this. He said, it's time that we start to recognize we'd be better off if Mexico and Canada were stronger, and that it's time that we stop seeing our nearest neighbors as foreigners, which is pretty different from what you heard from the Trump administration with their focus on the wall. Now, what this comes down to, again, for many Americans, they're interested in issues like immigration, narcotics and organized crime, sort of economic prospects, environmental issues. That's a natural North American agenda. But equally important, the stronger we have of North America, 500 million people, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency, better demographics than the rest of the world, that will make us more powerful in dealing with China and other parties. So that's sort of step one. The second one was trade, transnationalism, and technology. And here what I was trying to focus on was from the very founding of the United States in 1776, you could see that the founding fathers were looking on trade as more than a matter of economic efficiency. It was a question of partnerships with the rest of the world. And remember, they were trying to break free from a world of mercantilism and imperial colonial systems. So they wanted room for private actors, the whole role of transnational actors. And obviously technology has been very important in America's success as a growing economy and then in the Cold War. So that fits right nicely with the agenda that I talked about with some of the scientific and biological issues and our ultimate economic strength. The third is alliances, which, as you know, Steve, after Washington and Jefferson's warnings, the United States stayed away from alliances for about 150 years. Then from 1947 to 1949, we created, in some ways by accident, a new type of alliance system that was based on politics and diplomacy and economics as much as it was pure military power. That proved very successful during the Cold War. It was adapted after the Cold War. And then for the past 4 years, Trump, who, as you said, is transactional, really hasn't cared about quite denigrating of alliances. So the question is, how do you change alliances for the new types of agenda that we just talked about? The fourth was the need to get congressional and public support. In here, a lot of traditional foreign policy specialists kind of ignore working with Congress. In my book, I talk about the role that Senator Vandenberg played with Truman in 47-49 period. But if you think in more modern times about people like John McCain or Richard Lugar or Sam Nunn, these are important figures in terms of trying to help executive branches with foreign policy. So the question will be who, if anyone, steps up to that today. Frankly, I think there are some possibilities, which I've written about in various pieces, but we'll have to see. And then the last point is America's purpose. And this is one of my favorite ones. I don't mean to suggest the notion of the United States exceptionalism, because a lot of countries think they're exceptional. But if you go back to the founding of the U.S., they come up with seal the United States, which, in case you've forgotten what it looks like, it's on the back of your dollar bill. And it's that unfinished pyramid with the Eye of Providence above it, and the phrase below, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So they were thinking in big terms. Now, it's my proposition that the purpose of the United States evolved years. First, it was simply just to keep a republic alive in a world of empires. Then it was fighting for the Union to keep as Lincoln's last best hope of mankind. By the time of Woodrow Wilson, it's make the world safe for democracy, not necessarily making it a democracy. For Roosevelt, it's the four freedoms. In the Cold War, it's the leader. For Bill Clinton, it was the enlargement idea. So the question is, what role will the United States have today other than just being a powerful country? Trump obviously didn't feel that sort of larger role in the United States. And I'm not saying we have to be missionaries around the world, but we do have to have some sense about the world that we would like to see and what we can do to advance it.
So let me just push you a little bit further on that. Those five traditions require, in a way, an orientation, even North America, which you know that I am a big proponent of.
You're a big supporter
of North America. Yeah, exactly. But they require an orientation where citizens look at being engaged in the world as a net positive. Now, I have to be honest, I am related to a lot of military families from the Midwest, not highly educated over generations, but they fought for the country, and they felt like they fought for the country, and they fought the Cold War, but China won. They feel sort of left behind, abandoned, and they feel like the net plus, the net positives they get from global engagement aren't what they used to be. I won't call it isolationism, but I will call it ambivalence. And so when you look at that, and you look at that international orientation that has fed a lot of Donald Trump's popularity, does that give you some pause that America may be shifting back towards a more isolation? I won't call it fully isolationist, but a strategic contraction, if you will, from a lot of these challenges in the world.
Well, sure. After decades of long wars, the global financial crisis, now the pandemic setback, it's natural that people focus first at home. But let me give you a little historical sort of analogy here, Steve. In October of 1945, so that was the month after Japan surrendered, Gallup did a poll and asked the American people, are international relations vital to our interests? And the number that said yes was 7%. In 1946, the next year, as the devastation in Europe became more clearly known, as the Soviet Union's on the rise, the number jumped all the way up to 14%. Now, my point by this is that it's always been a challenge for American presidents to sort of explain the linkages. But here, again, I know it's popular among some of the union leaders to talk about American isolationism. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs does an annual survey, and the results are pretty striking. A bipartisan 68% of Americans favor an active role in the world. That's a little higher than it was in the Cold War. 68%, again, bipartisan, like the idea of a shared leadership role, where only 24% sought U.S. dominance. 2/3 of Americans think globalization benefits the United States. Nearly 3/4 think trade is good for the economy, and even 59% creates jobs. Support for NATO is at 73%. Now, as you know, because you know the polling world, these are imposing numbers. The question is, will a president be able to kind of organize them just as Truman did? My own view is that, and this is what I think the history shows, presidents do this most effectively both by explaining things and taking actions. So some of the ones that we've talked about, to biological security and climate, as well as some of the traditional nuclear security items. And I hope the new administration will do this.
Bob, a funny thing about your bio, which I've really enjoyed because I'm, a Twitter maniac myself, is that you're on the board of directors of Twitter. I had no idea, but I don't know if you're lurking on Twitter somewhere without me knowing, but I can't. Are you a practitioner of Twitter, or are you just someone on board to kind of make sure that, Twitter behaves itself. And what do you think about Twitter and social media in this age of politics? You've seen a lot. How is Twitter either helping or hurting our political scene?
Well, Steve, I couldn't reach your level of sort of appealing to a larger audience. And look, the reason I joined the board was because I wanted to learn more about it on the technology. I might be able to also help on the international side and a little bit on some of the governance issues, and also obviously have some familiarity with the financial and economic sector. But I think what you're seeing for all the companies in the social media space is, they're trying to adapt, and frankly, Jack is in his public testimony made this point, is they start out with actually kind of what I'll call the sort of extreme free speech, any sort of participation. That's kind of the values of the Silicon Valley. Then they had the problems with the 2016 election, so they've experimented with labels and different prohibitions and different sort of categories. And I think that's an ongoing sort of learning exercise. I know that the senior team from Dorsey on down takes account very much of what they consider to be the health of the conversation. I'm pleased that, at least from what we've learned so far, that their work and the work of Facebook and others have sort of seemed to limit the ability for intrusion sort of in the election process. But I think this will be a topic of ongoing debate. And you could see people taking a different direction. So some people say, oh, well, we don't want the platforms to interfere with any speaker. But on the other hand, others will say, well, yeah, there can be sort of information there that is provocative or leads to violence or conflict. So that if people want to go back to sort of the traditional controls on, or sort of limits or responsibilities for media with this so-called Section 230, frankly, you would open up to a series of legal actions. And so you might actually lead them to be more restrictive. So my own sense is that the technology companies are now fully aware of this. They want to engage the public in the dialogue. And yet it's going to be part of our society. And it's a certain irony. Trump criticizes these sort of networks when he obviously learned how to use them quite effectively.
Well, I had dinner with Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, a very small dinner, and we discussed it. And while that discussion was off the record, what I can say is that I was impressed with how concerned he was about censoring anyone, that the decisions he thought had to be careful not to go down a slippery slope, that there were certain principles. But, to see the anguish and the way his mind was turning was very important. Last question, Ambassador Robert Zoellick, Deputy Secretary. If Joe Biden were to call you up and said, hey, we could use your services, would you join? You were a prominent sort of John Hancock of the Never Trump crowd. So I'm just wondering if you would accept the Biden role.
Well, I know a lot of the Biden team, and informally I try to help them. They've got a lot of quality players and a lot of slots to fill with their own people. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. And I'm looking forward to the new team. I think that the challenges they face, as we've discussed, are very important for the United States in sort of getting back on track. And it's a different world context. And I have some experience in some of the international institutions beyond the traditional security space. I think those are going to be increasingly important. So however I can help them, or frankly, Republicans and Democrats in the Congress.
Well, Ambassador Robert Zoellick, statesman, diplomat, trade negotiator, and now chronicler of the history of U.S. foreign policy and America in the world. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to seeing how this all plays out. Thanks for joining us today. So what's the bottom line? Say what you will about the presidency of Donald J. Trump, he has forced real changes in the terms of American engagement in the world. America, even under a Joe Biden presidency, is going to be more selfish than in the past, less willing to provide security or do trade deals or share technological progress without clear returns for the country and its citizens. America is going to get back into global deals and into institutions like the Paris Climate Accord or the World Health Organization and the WTO, but those are low-hanging fruit. As my guest Robert Zoellick says, America is going to be deeply distracted at home by tensions over the pandemic, over race, over economic inequality, and the fact that the country is divided nearly down the middle on Trumpism. America's diplomacy is going to be a lot more humble going forward, not as a gesture of humility, but rather because it's not going to get away with arrogance in these times. And that's the bottom line.